All right, thank you everybody for joining our RV meetup today. We are very excited to have you guys here with us. We continue to have our online meetups monthly, and once a quarter we are now having physical face-to-face meetings. So if you are nearby, please join us at our nearby facility hosted by Medico. Thank you very much for Medico for hosting our once a quarter physical presence meetings. We're very excited to see some of you guys face-to-face, so please come out and join us. In case you're not familiar with the area, Medico is in right outside of Salem, and a little bit north, and you just enter through the employee entrance, and there's a fantastic facility set up there. We had our first meetup there in April, and we plan to have another one in September. Before we get to our today's presentation and speaker, I think Alex, you had a event highlight for us.
Sure. So B-Sides Roanoke is next Saturday at Virginia Western. I put the link in the chat for the actual B-Sides conference. And I think it's $25 a ticket. I think that's still the price. Just yeah, if anybody knows anything about it or wants to chime in, feel free. It's a security conference coming up, so
fantastic. Yeah, I mean that's a $25, like a couple of coffees, right? For the price of that, seeing and being around all the security experts that will be there. I think that's a fantastic event to go to if you're nearby. All right, thank you very much, Alex, for that. So very excited to have Joe Hocking here presenting tonight on the introduction to developing in Unity. I've been very much wanting to see a presentation on Unity, so really excited to have you here with us tonight, Joe. Joe currently works for Qualcomm as a senior staff engineer using Unity. Joe wrote the first edition of Unity in Action while working for Synapse Games as a developer and of web and mobile games. Joe has taught classes at the University of Illinois at Chicago, at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and Columbia College Chicago. Joe lives in Chicago suburbs, and his website is newartist.com, and we'll post that here in the chat here. Hopefully I said that right, or is that said a little bit different way there, Joe?
I usually I purposely misspelled artiste, so it's
artiste. Artiste, of course. My bad there, Joe.
Okay. I purposely misspelled that word because it gives people a chuckle. Like, yes.
Put that right here on the chat. There we go, for everybody to have. Joe has a long career in game development, but technically only 2 places he's working at were game companies, including Synapse Games. Before that, he also created digital artworks in collaboration with Mark. I'm going to butcher his last name.
Skwarek.
Got it. Showing their work in venues like famous Accountants Gallery in New York City and Boston Cyberarts, ISEA in Ireland, and Sunshine Gallery in Beijing. That is a fantastic locations there around the world, Joe. Thank you again very much for coming and presenting to our humble group.
Yeah.
Take it away.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you for asking me to give you guys a little introduction to Unity. So, all right. So, my name's Joseph Hocking. There's the book I wrote, Unity in Action. It's up to the 3rd edition. It came out like a year ago. I'll probably be starting to write a 4th edition relatively soon, just because enough has changed already. But at any rate, the 1st edition, as you mentioned, I wrote while I was working at this company called Synapse Games. And then that's just the URL for my website in case you're curious about me. All right, so here, let me give a bit of a intro about me first. I guess so I started using Unity while I was working at Synapse Games. They actually hired me to work on a web game because I used to be a Flash developer. Like I used to use Flash, but about a year into me being there, kind of the bottom dropped out of that market, and so the company they decided like, hey, we want to pivot to doing mobile games, and so my boss asked me to investigate different options for developing mobile games. Among the options, I investigated the one I liked most, and then after I presented to him, the one he liked most as well was Unity. So so I started using that, and then you can see a little screenshot of the game in Unity. It was called Tyrant Unleashed. I don't think it exists anymore because that was years ago, but obviously I got proficient enough with Unity at the time that I ended up writing this book, Unity in Action. So, all right. Then since then, I've worked at a number of different companies using Unity, but not for games, mostly for different 3D simulations. So, simulations of like shopping or simulations of training data, options training data. Anyway, and so now though I'm working at Qualcomm, which I remember when the recruiter contacted me, I was a little surprised because while I'm very familiar with Qualcomm, the company, from all my time developing mobile games, I always, or I only knew them as like, okay, they're making the chips that go into these, Android phones, like, the Samsung phones and whatnot. I had no idea they would want to hire a Unity expert, but you can see the logo here for what's called Snapdragon Spaces. That's this SDK they've started building for doing XR stuff, mostly augmented reality, but also virtual reality as well. And since a large part of that SDK is interoperability with Unity, that's where they ended up hiring me. Anyway. All right, so let me talk about Unity itself for a second. I'm guessing many of you have heard of Unity before, but in case you haven't heard of Unity before, it's a popular game engine used very widely, used for a variety of different kinds of games. Some of the other really widely known game engines would be like Unreal or Godot, but Unity is a very popular one, very widely used one, and specifically of specific interest to you guys in particular, because since you guys are .NET developers, this is a .NET development group. Well, Unity is programmed in C#, so most .NET developers are going to be very familiar with the programming language then, versus using C++ or something in other tools. So here are a few screenshots I just grabbed of some games that were developed in Unity. Up top, that's a game called Cuphead, very popular game. That one exists on like Xbox, PlayStation. I don't remember off the top of my head if it was ported to desktops as well, but it very well may be. I mean, that would be likely. So like PC games. On the left, that's Monument Valley. That's a very popular mobile game. And then at the bottom, that's a screenshot from Beat Saber, which is a very popular VR game. And so these were all built in Unity. Unity can build all of these kinds of games. And then as my sort of like little note at the bottom there points out, like, not only can you build from Unity to all these different platforms, but you can build both 2D or 3D games. It's a tool that enables both of those kinds of things. So, all right. So, so like I said, I'm at this point just going to fire up Unity and get started showing you guys how to build something within Unity. So, all right. So the first step here is I'm going to just start a new project. Oops, reacting a little slowly, presumably because I'm presenting at the same time. But anyway, I'll just call this like Roanoke demo. We'll just go from there. So you could see, by the way, as a Unity, right, from the start asked like, oh, are you making a 2D game or a 3D game or whatnot? Most of the relevant settings actually can be changed afterwards. It's not like I'm locked in from the beginning. It's just these templates. It's just like templates for any other sort of coding project. It's sort of like it just helps set things up in a way that makes it move faster. So I see there's one question, or what IDE you use. So I use Visual Studio for Mac. I'm on a Mac, incidentally. Visual Studio is one that interacts really well with Unity. That said, any C# IDE would work. I mean, people at work, there's some people using Rider. I know that there are some other options that like Visual Studio, but then there's also Visual Studio Code, and then sometimes people switch up which one. In the end, Unity actually, it's funny. Whereas you're probably used to like hitting run within the IDE. Unity doesn't work that way. It actually treats the IDE almost like a really fancy text editor, where you write the code, but then you still have to hit play within Unity to actually make the game run. So anyway, you can see here we go. I have a blank scene because I just created a new project. So I'm going to start out simple with let's see here. Well, you know what? I'm going to start out by just creating a cube. But before I even do anything, let me just explain what we're even looking at here. So over here, this is what's called the scene view. This just shows everything in that's in the scene. Scene is kind of an abstraction, meaning like all the different stuff that's currently loaded into memory is what scene really means. You'll notice there's a game view here. Now, scene view and game view are very similar. However, they're crucially different in that the game view is what you actually see while the game is playing. The scene view is, again, like this sort of like global look at everything that's in memory right now. The game view specifically, it's showing through this camera that's in the scene. It's showing what is the camera looking at. It's the view from the camera. So if, for example, I were to now create a cube and stick that cube in front of the camera, well then, so even though I'm looking at it from this sort of like remove position, I can see like, okay, I put a cube there and the camera's over here. What I see in the game view is the view from the camera. So anyway, what else? What other tabs I have up here? Oh, asset store, by the way, I'm not going to go into detail about what this means, but long story short, this is where you can like buy stuff from, the other Unity users and incorporate it into your game. You like somebody made like a cool soldier model, then you could buy it and, download and use in Unity. All right, so the hierarchy view here, as you could probably notice when I created the cube, it got added to the hierarchy view here. The hierarchy view, this is just a list of all the objects that are currently in the scene. Where this is useful though is not only is it useful as a list, but of all the different objects, but then like you can actually hierarchy link the objects to each other. And then so in this case, if I move the child cube, then it just moves by itself. But now if I move the parent cube, it's actually moving both at the same time. That's what the hierarchy linkages do. Incidentally, I like to have this set to pivot instead of center. It's a subtle difference here. This is showing the center of sort of like this entire hierarchy structure, but pivot just shows me like the center of this object itself. And it's like I said, it's a subtle difference, but I actually prefer it that way. Then let's see down here. This is a list of all the different assets in the scene. Assets is just a umbrella term for like all the different files I'm using. So like all the different texture images, PNGs or whatnot would be considered assets. But similarly, all the different code files are considered assets. And then meanwhile, you'll see this new project. It actually started with a single asset already in here. This is a scene file. So again, just everything that's in the scene is now just sort of like this is a snapshot of everything loaded up in the scene. So then later I can reload that scene, or I can switch between scenes if I had multiple scenes in my game. So anyway, and then the console here, this is just where different logging messages show up. Both, if I purposely insert some logging, but also errors show up here. So typically when I'm actually using Unity, I actually have my tabs docked like this because I'm constantly looking at what errors are showing up. And but anyway, so I'm sure this whole notion of just dragging the tabs around to modify the UI is quite familiar to you guys from different IDs or whatnot. And then finally, over here on the right side, this is called the inspector. Whereas the hierarchy view, this gives me a list of all the objects in the scene. The inspector gives me details about whichever object I currently have selected. So here it's giving me details about this cube. If I switch to the camera, it's going to give me details about the camera, etc. So, all right. So I'm going to delete that second cube because I actually just want to have one cube for now. And then in the assets down here, I'm going to create a script, which not that I really need to for this demo, but usually I would create a folder called scripts and stick in here. But anyway, let's create now a new C# code file. Now, I'm just going to call this hello world for now. Now, one thing about Unity, which is a little bit annoying, but you get used to it, or I got used to it pretty fast. So script files always have to be attached to something in the scene. Even if what that script is doing is sort of like more abstract. Like basically that makes perfect sense when you have some object moving around, then it makes perfect sense that the script which controls it is attached to it. But on the other hand, sometimes you have these more abstract sort of like, handlers of everything going on, or file system handlers or whatever. And those kind of scripts, they still need to be attached to an object. For that purpose, I often just end up creating like an empty object and then just call it like, I don't know, scene controller or something, and then all of my more abstract scripts get attached to that object. This is an object which you can see, it's very simple, like there's barely anything here. So anyway, I'm now going to drag over. I just drag and drop my script, and so that links it. And now you can, hello world, the hello world script is going to be activated when I play. So nothing's going to actually happen yet because I haven't written anything in the script, but you can see I play, it switched to the game. All right, so let's take a look in the script. And so you can see here it's opening up Visual Studio because I just double clicked on the script file here. Again, you can tell Unity to use different IDEs. Use Visual Studio Code or use Rider, whatever. You can tell Unity that's the IDE you should be sending scripts to, not the default one. So, all right. So anyway, here again, I'm hoping all the syntax here is going to look very familiar to you guys because again, the programming language then is C#. When I started using Unity, it actually supported a couple different languages. However, over time, the language that everybody kept using, certainly it's the language I was using from the start, was C#. And so they eventually just kind of dropped support for the other languages they were using, and then just C#. The other languages being like, I mean, part of the reason nobody was using them is because they were very non-standard languages. Like it was this weird sort of like Unity specific variant of JavaScript was one of them, and then there was this like obscure Python variant called Boo, which they supported. No one used that, so I don't know where that came from. But anyway, all right. So the way it works, though. So first off, everything that any class that's going to be linked to an object, you need to inherit from monobehavior here. Not every script you use in Unity has to inherit from monobehavior, but every script that's going to be linked to an object does need to inherit from monobehavior. Funnily enough, by the way, I didn't notice until I started writing my book that monobehavior is spelled British style with the OU here, because my copy editor was like, wait, is that spelled correctly? And I was like, oh yeah, I always copy pasted it. I'd never actually written it out before. So anyway, so when a monobehavior script is linked to an object in the scene, then there are certain sort of like magic methods that will automatically function. And these are just part of Unity's sort of like life cycle of scene objects. And so you can see the two most commonly used functions here are start and update. These aren't the only ones, but these are by far the most commonly used ones. And that's why sort of like when you create a new script, they're just automatically just inserted in. First, so as the comments kind of tell you, start is called as soon as the scene, as soon as this object basically is loaded up. Start is called once. Meanwhile, update is called every frame. Incidentally, I would hope that you guys are familiar with the concept of like games in terms of computer graphics or games. But at any rate, it's just like basically there's a loop going on behind the scenes where a bunch of stuff happens, and then a picture is rendered. Then that's one frame. Next frame, a bunch of stuff happens, another picture is rendered. That's the next frame. Anyway, so update is just called every single frame, once every single frame. So anyway, so for our little hello world here, I'm going to so, and then now if I run this, that's obviously a logging command, and as I mentioned, logging messages are going to show up in the console view. So now when I hit play, then and once the game starts, hello world is just going to show up in the console. There we go. Very exciting. Yeah. So all right. So that's the first script. That has anything happening that we've created in Unity. Let's sort of dress this up a little bit just because it's kind of boring. So I'm just going to move the camera up a little bit, and then you can see here. This is just information. It's called the transform. That term just comes from math. Basically, it's just moving an object around in 3 dimensions is referred to as transforming its position. So anyway, that's where that word comes from. But so you can see, I'm just going to go like 5. Oops. Lost track of where the object is. Yeah, here, let me do it a different way. Let me just. All right. I just wanted to make our view of the object slightly more interesting. Like it's kind of skewed off angle. So you can see there's our cube. All right. Now then, the first thing I want to do, just as a demonstration, I'm going to start spinning this cube around. So first things first. How do I want to do it? You know what? I'll make another script and put it on the cube. There are a number of different ways to have objects like sort of to have scripts reference objects in the scene, but certainly one simple way is to actually just put the script on the object of. So I'll just put rotate forever on a cube here. It was taking a little while to compile before it would let me attach it. But anyway, so now I'm going to say this dot transform dot oops. Right. And I'll go back to explain that line, but first I just want actually see if it's going to work. So if I typed it in correctly. But, so you can see the object spinning very slowly. I should have gone with a bigger number because that's very slowly. But anyway, you can see the object slowly spinning around. So So to explain what's happening. So again, remember this is happening just repeatedly in a loop every frame. So every frame, I'm essentially saying like, take the transform component of the object. Remember again that the cube object, it has one of these. These are all, by the way, these are all referred to as components. All the different things attached to it. But anyway, the cube has this transform component, and the transform component then there are a number of ways actually to apply rotations to objects, but one simple way is there's actually just a method of the transform component that's just called rotate. So it's like, okay, I'll just do that. By the way, as far as the fact that I had to put this little F there, that's just because in C# by default, decimal values go like to, I forget what I think they're doubles, but actually the Unity's API just needs floats for basically everything. So I gotta keep like, putting the little F there to say like, no, this isn't a double, this is a float. Anyway, yeah, and so what happens this here, let me temporarily just throw up and start, and you can see, so the rotate command, it will apply that change to the object's rotation value, but it'll do it like instantaneously. That's what the rotate command does. So you can see by putting in start, it doesn't look like the object is continuously rotating. That's because it's that rotation value only got applied once at the very beginning. So instead, what you want to do in order to have it like smoothly rotate over time, you want to keep applying additional bits of rotation like just every single frame, and you can see like the object looks like it's rotated a little bit every single frame. So that's what's going on there. I had mentioned that there are, by the way, a couple different ways of referencing objects. Another way is actually this approach. So game object up, mover, and then instead of this object being the one to rotate, I'm going to say mover is the one that rotates. Okay. So in that case, though, or wait, I have this. Well, let's turn this script off. So now, scene control, you'll notice mover, it now has, I can link a reference in there. So that's what I'm going to do. Just drag and drop the object and be like, okay, now refer to this other object in the scene. And here it's got that rotate forever script. I'm just going to uncheck it to temporarily not do that one. We're not running that script anymore. We're running only our hello world script, but the hello world script, references this other object. And that's why, I can control this other object, make it rotate from a different script. So anyway, by the way, I forgot to explain what game object means. Game object is essentially, I had mentioned how all of these things in the inspector are called components. Game object is just like a container of components. It's just a list of components. That's literally all it is. You still have to say like, okay, from this game object, I want the transform component. From this game object, I want the, I don't know, if I was doing something with a collider, I want the collider component. From this object, I want the, you get the idea. So yeah, game object is literally just a basket of components. Cube is a game object. Camera is a game object, which just happens to have a camera component. Cube is a game object, which just happens to have this cube component. My light here is, a game object that just happens to have a light component on it. All right. Where do I want to go from here? Let's see. Already spinning around. So, well, here, you know what? Actually, maybe some basic keyboard controls would be nice at this point. So let's do that next. All right. So I'm going to turn back the rotate forever, the poorly named rotate forever script, because I'm about to do stuff other than having it rotate forever. But whatever. Let's just get rid of this reference because I don't need it anymore. That was just a little demonstration. So, all right. Now, instead of having it, by the way, actually, before I even do any sort of keyboard controls, let me demonstrate another thing here. So, all right. Now, if you're looking at this just from a code perspective, it's sort of like, well, speed never gets assigned. So what the heck, Joe? However, public variables show up in the inspector here. And so you can see I could set speed to something else. And actually, as a debugging tool, you can even change this while the game is running just to see what effect changing it will have. So let's just change that to, you can see the cube is rotating very slowly. If I change the speed to 5, you'll notice it's spinning a lot faster. It's actually a little glitchy in its spinning. That's, again, probably just a side effect of the fact that, I have like the meetup running at the same time, so my computer's like, kind of freaking out. But anyway, let's. And then one thing which I always forget about, though, is any changes I make while the game is running get those changes are undone when I stop the game. So I got to remember oh yeah, now I got to make that change permanent. Anyway, all right. So actually, I like 5. Let's go to 5. All right. So anyway, let's put in some basic input. Now there are a couple of ways of doing input in Unity. And actually, for example, what I do at work is something a little more advanced, but just using these sort of this, you can see these like a static class, the input static class is the easiest thing for demo purposes. So I'm just going to do that. Anyway, so let me just remind myself real quick, because I actually haven't used this API in a long time. So I'm getting. Whatever. Well, all right. So should be axis, I believe. Yeah, get axis horizontal. Oh wait, no, it's not an if. It's all right, let's write down. All right, and so you can't tell what's going on, but horizontal is an axis that maps to the arrow keys, the cursor keys on my keyboard. So when I'm holding down the arrow key, then you can see it start to spin. When I hold the other arrow key, it's spinning the other direction, and it's just not doing anything when I'm not pressing any keys. So, all right. And then let's see. One last thing I actually want to do before I open it up to just like you guys asking open-ended questions. It is kind of sorry about that. Obviously, if you're making a game, then you're going to want things to look nicer than just like this white cube. So the details of game art, I mean, it's a huge topic, but let me just start doing one thing. Let's just make this red. So what you got to do actually is you create what's called a material, and then I apply that material to the cube here. I forget where. I believe there's. Oh, here we go. We got a list of materials. So actually, I don't. It's one material. So there we go. And you can see the cube is red now. So that's what it's going to look like. All right. So obviously, what I just did was very sort of just a glimpse of what you can do with Unity, just a little taste of how to get started. But yeah, obviously then, to make a complete game, I pretty much just be repeating what I was just doing for additional, controls, or, if I want to have other characters in the scene, then I'll bring in those models and apply the materials and blah, blah, blah. So yeah, I, like I was saying, at this point, I guess I'm more curious what you guys want to know about, and start addressing those questions. Obviously, a little plug for my book here too. If you want to go beyond just my little taste of how to use Unity, know how to build something more substantial than Unity in action, go pick up my book. All right.
We got so many questions. I don't want to start though. I can start.
Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I'll start. So how does this compare to something like the Unreal Engine? Is it on par, or is it a different kind of thing? Is it apples and orange comparison, or is it more of a
It's definitely not an apples to oranges kind of situation. They're very similar, very much on par with each other. There are naturally going to be different pros and cons why you use one or the other. For example, I already mentioned, one of the, at least for you guys, one of the more obvious pros of Unity is going to be the fact that you're programming in C#, whereas using Unity, you'd be programming in C++. And actually, depending on what you're doing in Unity, you probably wouldn't even be programming at all, but actually you'd be using this, I guess it's still technically programming, but you'd be using their visual programming tool. It's called Blueprints to wire things together. That said, Unreal, one of its more obvious pros is the simple fact that it has a larger presence in the what's called AAA game space. Unity actually, if you look at the game industry as a whole, Unity is used more than Unreal. However, that, I mean, I'm including in that like the whole raft of like crappy little mobile games. You know what I mean? Like Unity gets used a lot for those kind of games. Whereas like by AAA games, I'm talking about the kind of games that you would see like advertised on TV, like Fortnite or stuff like that. Those kind of games definitely have a bigger presence in Unreal. So yeah, yeah.
I heard you can run Unity games in like iPhones. How's that work? How's that?
So the what the Unity player, like under the hood, like in a technological sense, what it does on each platform is slightly different. But on most platforms, what it does, and certainly on iPhones, what it does is it actually like just generates the binaries for that platform. iPhone is a special case though, because Apple requires you to use their build tools. Like you have to use Xcode. So what Unity did, and what other tools which build games for iPhone do, it actually generates an Xcode project. Unity, like its build, it generates an Xcode project with the stuff you need, and then you got to build the actual like iPhone app in Xcode. The way this works is they do all kinds of like using all kinds of crazy code generation tools, like LLVM, I believe is what it's called. But anyway, but yeah, so.
I know in .NET 8, they've got actual stuff that will generate binaries for different platforms.
Mm-hmm.
So it's actually kind of interesting. And I heard that Unity is moving towards using the .NET Core items.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, there certainly have been changes under the hood over the years. So it's entirely possible. For example, this whole like need in their tool chain to like generate an Xcode project and then you build from Xcode. Like, for all I know, that's going to go away in the future. Like, when you talk about like Android though, for example, like it can generate the APKs. That's the Android package directly. Like when you hit build in Unity, since Unity can just like call the the Android compiler itself, then it like hitting build within Unity actually generates the Android package. But again, on iPhones, what Unity is actually generating is an Xcode project, and then you got to go to Xcode to generate a little iPhone app. So.
That update method gets called for every frame.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't see that you had actually programmed anything in there to create a loop or anything. Is that loop just sort of built into the platform? Is it kind of a message, a continuous message loop or something?
It is built into the platform. There are a number of methods which Unity basically just sort of like I mentioned how like any script that's going to be like attached to an object in the scene has to inherit from mono behavior. So Unity, as just like part of its built-in loop, it just like goes through the mono behavior objects and then calls like update on every mono behavior object. Obviously, if you had a ton of objects being called separately like that, it could get very inefficient. So that's why you then start having to be smarter about like, okay, I'm not going to have an update call on every single object. Instead, I'm just going to use like one update call that just like farms out to the relevant. But yes, that's more or less what what's going on.
So that's an abstract class, I guess, that you're inheriting from.
What's really interesting is it's not. One would assume it is, but it's not actually. It's actually kind of weird. I don't know the details of how Unity is accessing that, but I believe the way it works is sort of like. I should backtrack. So even though as a developer using Unity, you program in C#, Unity itself is not programmed in C#. It's actually using C# as just sort of like a scripting language, whereas Unity itself is in fact programmed in C++. And so among other things, like the whole sort of like life cycle, it's a little like strange from, well, just as an example, like, so in the case of how it accesses these different objects or these different methods of the mono behavior objects. So what it actually, again, I don't know the details, so, don't, I'm not, don't assume that, what I'm about to say is the be all end all of this process, but it's sort of like when the scene is started, then as part of loading the scene, Unity actually uses reflection to build a list of every object in the scene that has an update method, but that list is actually like exposed to the C++ layer of code as a sort of like, non-managed, like just an array essentially. And it just, iterates through this non-managed array and says like, okay, these objects all have an update method to call. On a day-to-day basis, I don't really think too much about that process, which is why I'm a little shaky on it.
So you said that the loop is kind of built into Unity.
Mm-hmm.
What other functionality is built in? Is there like collision detection, gravity, stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, so in interestingly enough, Unity is a controversial decision. They've recently, the last few years, they've been moving to have a functionality that used to be just sort of like considered built into the engine, actually now like sort of farmed out to these different packages that you got to import. Most of these packages though are still like, I mean, they're free, so it's not like you have to buy them separately or something like that. But anyway, but yeah, absolutely. Like Unity includes collision detection functionality, so that your physics objects. Unity includes like animation capabilities, so that you can have objects with animation, and you can actually add that already. The fact that Unity can load up a number of different file formats is obviously like, I mean, you can't just take that for granted. Like Unity does that. Like in terms of useful game sort of functionality, it has a fair amount of audio handling that happens as well. It's not uncommon by any means for professional sort of games to actually just sort of like forsake Unity's built-in audio capabilities to have some plugin that's even more powerful. Something like from Wise or something like that. That said, the games I made, we always just used Unity's built-in audio functionality because that was plenty for us. Like play some background music and occasional sound effects, whatever.
So does it have directional sound as well?
It does, but very basic. Very basic. That's
Okay.
That's an example of where very professional sort of games, if they need to do all kinds of like cool directional sound kind of stuff, they probably start be looking at some third party framework to handle the audio. So.
What about sensors? Like, what kind of support does Unity have for sensors? Like, I noticed you had a lot of like art installation stuff on your website. So,
Sure.
And have you seen that change over time? Like, how has how have the sensor integration kind of features changed?
Well, so first off, by sensors, I'm assuming you're talking about stuff like motion detectors, heat sensors, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Essentially, there's no support. It's designed in such a way that you could bring in packages to have those and there certainly are open source packages for that kind of thing. That said, there's nothing built into Unity to interface with those kinds of sensors. Even though Unity is not solely used for games, it's definitely it's focused on games, and typically people don't need that kind of thing for games.
So I met a guy once who had built a software with Unity, and it was for a pool table, and he was integrating it with sensors. So when you hit the ball into the corner, into the pocket, it was able to register with the sensor and then go into the game and register that as a score. So like Joseph was saying, there's probably no out of the box integration there, but with packages and everything else, like there's a lot that's possible there.
No, again, there's even though there's nothing built into Unity for that kind of thing, there's just tons of open source libraries that you can pull in to do that kind of stuff.
So the library is available where you can build like a novice game. I mean, I'm trying to think, how do I get from, the box to a person or something that looks like a person walking in a world? And it could be like basic or whatnot. Like, how do you know what I mean? Like, how do you make that leap?
Sure. No, so right off the bat, the first thing to realize is, so like a tool like Unity, I guess to make an analogy, it's a game engine. You can almost, to make an analogy for like somebody familiar with, I'm assuming most of you are like familiar with web development. Like it's almost like it's kind of like the browser at that point. It's the thing that ties everything together, but you have to create all the pieces separately and externally. Like you can't create your images in the browser. The browser can show the images, but the images had to be created in a tool like Photoshop or something. Well, same goes with like if you want to have some 3D models, Unity can import the 3D models, and it can, you can load the 3D models and you can display them. But to create them in the first place, you had to use a tool like Blender or something. A pretty typical professional tool for doing 3D art is called Maya, but a really capable open source alternative is I already mentioned Blender. That's one I play around a lot. Since it's open source. So,
are there like asset libraries to get started or stuff you can purchase maybe?
Sure. Yeah, I already I alluded to when I was showing the different views within Unity. I alluded to the asset store. Unity itself, the company, maintains an asset store where like you can just buy like models that people have created and use them in your games. Unreal does the same thing. They have an Unreal asset store. I don't know what it's called, but it's the same idea. Like people can make assets that you can import into Unreal. There are also third-party asset stores, like for example, there's this website itch.io, which actually is mostly a showcase of different games, but it also people can list for sale like different assets they've created. you can get art that way. Or obviously not necessarily for sale. Maybe it's listed there at $0, and now you can just download it for free. And people do that too. So,
How easy is it to take an asset, an object, and bring it in and put it in place of your box or skin your box? Or I don't know how you would do
sure.
that.
Well, here, let me show you an example of actually just doing that.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Sure. So here we go.
I can plug Humble Bundle as well. They have sometimes specific bundles with assets for game development as well.
Absolutely. Humble Bundle is a great one. What I'm about to do is go to Sketchfab. That's another place you can just, well, actually, I take that back. I'm not going to use Sketchfab, but that is another place that you could grab models from. Let me just think, like Unity's asset storage. Well, you know what? Actually, I take it back. I will go to Sketchfab. And so let's go to Sketchfab here. Obviously, I don't care about this particular page, how to be a Sketchfab rockstar. Thanks. Anyway, I'm just going to like free person. See what comes. Oh yeah, I guess I should specify free low poly, by the way, because otherwise I'll get these like crazy models that are appropriate for like movies or something. But like no, I want to. Excuse me. Yeah, I want something that I could like, use in a game. So all right, come on. The heck. These are not models. How do I get to the models?
Those do not look like low polygon.
Wait. This is I'm looking at the blog. Duh. I don't want to search the blog. I want to search the models. But anyway. Hello. Okay. Here we go. Yeah, sorry. I was looking at the blog. It's like, okay, that. Yep. Let me restrict it to downloadable and. Yeah, what the heck? Oh. There we go. Let me just grab one that's semi-interesting looking. So.
Is it like I don't know very much about game programming or anything. I've done a little bit of like low-level graphics, but is it easy to take like a model that has like bones and morphs and just like interact with those data structures in Unity, or do the models have to have like animations like already sort of associated with them? Or?
I mean, ultimately, the kind of data you're describing, it's sort of like in terms of what Unity will work with out of the sort of like out of the box. There are certain specific kind of animation formats that Unity will support. That said, I mean, you can just like roll your own and work with other, roll your own system and work with other sorts of data. In general, you don't want to do that unless you're doing something like really specific or really special case, because in general, the things that Unity supports out of the box are going to be the most useful things for developing a game. Here, sure. Let's download the OBJ. OBJ happens to be one of the file formats that Unity supports. So, all right. Whoops. And I threw that into materials, which doesn't make any sense. All right. That's the model. Now, you'll notice the model right now, it looks like, it's just white. That's because the also it looks like it's inverted. Actually, it looks like it's a little hard to tell if you don't know what you're looking for, but it kind of looks like we're actually seeing the other side of the model, not the side closest to us. That would be something I would need to fix. Obviously, if we were, if I was making some, if I was see what I mean about how like her arm, it actually looks like it's inverted. But anyway, obviously, if I were trying to use this in a professional game, I'd need to fix that. But for purposes of our little demo here, whatever. So you'll notice though textures. That's where like basically. So first off, I'm going to make this material white again, but then I'm going to assign this texture to this material, and then I'm going to assign this material. Where the heck is it?
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
That's cool. Huh.
And so, yeah, if I got rid of my cube here and instead, put my, rotate forever script on this model here. Now I play the game, then it is rotating very slowly because let's crank up the speed on this. And, you can see that it's rotating
That's
as I press the arrow keys. You can see, incidentally, getting back to the whole like, what does Unity provide? Like, obviously, it's providing some lighting and shadow information. Like that again is something which, when you get used to working with computer graphics a lot, you quickly realize like you can't take that stuff for granted because it's not just automatic. Like something has to do that. Like something on the computer has to do that. Well, in this case, Unity is just doing that. Like I just say like, here's my object, and then Unity just here, let me make a big old floor underneath her. And you can see Unity is just casting a shadow from her onto the ground.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, and it looks like she's got different reflective surfaces as well.
Yeah, like I said, this model is kind of like ugly stuff is going on where it's sort of like it's inverted and stuff. Like yeah, definitely I would be if I were trying to use this in an actual game, I would be fixing that up. Anyway, just move the camera to be closer to her because that was really far away. So anyway.
So if you wanted to make her walk across the screen, I assume you would have to have like a series of images that would show her in various positions, and you would just kind of go from one image to another, and it would sort of look like she was walking across the screen. Is that true?
That's not exactly true. I mean, like basically for 2D animation, what you just described is true. Here, let me stop showing this. Go back to for 2D animation, what you just described is very true. Since it's just a picture, then in order for like it to look like it's moving, the picture you need to have a new picture. 3D, the way things work when you're dealing with 3D graphics is different though, because objects since you can define like the actual like 3D volume of an object and then just move your camera around and see it from different angles, then rather than defining it in terms of like individual pictures, you're actually the animation has to be defined in terms of like the structure of the object, the vertices. Incidentally, if you're again unfamiliar with the 3D graphics, like basically every object is actually comprised of a bunch of triangles that are just fit together to make it look like. And so then by moving the vertices of these triangles, it looks like the shape is moving around. There is a style of animation called blend shapes where like you can just in your animation tool, Blender, Maya, whatever, you can manipulate the vertices directly as an animator. That's usually not the way you want to go though. Doing any sort of animation, including games, but like movies as well. Like usually, just because like the number of vertices that are going to be there is just like wow, like you'd go insane having to manage them like individually. So instead, there's this animation technique called skeletal animation, where even though the object is sort of like a continuous skin, you actually define these abstract, they're referred to as bones, but obviously they're not modeled out bones. They're just abstract like information of like the bones inside the arm. And then when you move the bones around, the skin of the arm moves with it. And then, so that way it's a lot, as an animator, then it's a lot more manageable to be like, okay, instead of having to care about every single vertex, I'm just caring about all the different bones. Now,
like a stick figure, I guess, right?
What's that?
It's more like a stick figure.
It is more like a stick figure. Although the analogy I usually use is it's more like puppeteering. Because if you think about the 3D model as the puppet, it's like you made this puppet and like, okay, great, you've got a 3D model, but it's not doing anything. The process of animating then is sort of like being a puppeteer. So you're making the model move around.
Are there libraries to help make you do motion? Like, I would think like certain motions are well understood now. Like, for example, a human walking, right?
Well, I mean, there's both a short answer and a long answer to that. I'll start with the short answer. By the way, there's this jargon term, mocap. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but that's just short for motion capture. That's where you have actors actually doing the motions, and then you use special systems to record the movements that they're making. Well, then there are for sale, and there are what are called mocap libraries, where people have just like recorded actors doing a bunch of different motions, and then you can just like buy these motions and apply those motions to your rigged characters. Rigged is nice, another bit of jargon term. Like basically, rigged is if model is the process of like just sort of like generating the 3D volume. I'm using my arm here. Like let's say I modeled out my arm. rigging is the process of inserting all those abstract little bones. So, and then saying like, the hand model is now associated with these bones. Well, now that I've done the rigging, I can then apply animation data onto those bones. Where does the animation data come from? There are lots of different sources of animation data. But one source are these mocap libraries I just talked about, where like you can just take a recording of a person and then just apply that to, the skeleton. And now that, like I said, is mocap as an answer to your question. That's the short answer. The longer answer, though, is like, obviously the performances you get that way are going to be very canned. It's using a mocap library that way is sort of like the 3D animation equivalent of like using stock photos. It's like, yeah, you get a nice photo, but it's going to look very generic. It's going to look very generic and very canned. If most games, they're going to have some combination of like, they might still use a lot of mocap, but now they're not buying a library. Instead, they have like actors doing the mocap for their game specifically. There's a lot of that. Obviously, that's super expensive. But then you also have animators, just hand animating, where like somebody actually just like physically manipulates, the bones. And again, going back to my puppeteering analogy, at that point, that's like you've hired the puppeteers to,
The best situation is where they use a combination, and sometimes the arms and legs don't move like they're supposed to move. So all of a sudden you have a leg sticking out that's straight up in the air or stuff like that.
and actually, the really complex animation systems have all kinds of dials for blending between like different clips of animation data. Like you might have a clip of animation data of a person running, but then you want your character to transition smoothly from running to, stopping. And then, so since the stopping and the running are two separate clips, you then have to have a system that blends between them. And there is all kinds of tech for that kind of purpose. Unity, incidentally, has tech for doing that built in, but for your purposes, you may want something even nicer than what Unity has built in. I know the animators I work with, like they've started experimenting with like AI tools actually for doing that kind of stuff, where like the AI analyzes the motion and then sort of like determines, generates like the actual pose, like based on like input poses. Anyway, so crazy stuff.
I'd like to add one. I'm going to put a link in the chat, and just curious, like I just found this thing Googling like $30. How realistic is it that something like for $30 you can get motion like that? Or is it just kind of like,
On the one hand, it's perfectly realistic that this is an example of what I was just talking about, where like you can just buy these canned animations. However, you at the same time you have to be basically you just have to rein in your expectations a little bit with this kind of thing. First off, all you're getting is the animation. You still need to provide the rig model. Now you could buy a rig model, and then so let's say that costs another $30. Whoa, whatever, $60. That's still not that bad, right? But on the one hand, that's just one character. Your whole game is going to have a bunch of characters. Okay, let's say, I don't know, is it $60 for each one? That's still not much, right? Well, okay, but that's still only characters. The art for your game, now you need the levels. You need, the walls to be built. You need the grass. You need, so like it's when you look at assets in an asset store, it's really easy to if you're not familiar with the process, to underestimate just how much stuff you need in order to make your game. Like there's just, even people who are professionals who've been doing this for years, it's a constant problem. They constantly underestimate how much just stuff they need. And that's, a lot of people who, people who just, play games, they often don't realize just like how many people are involved in making a really big game. Now, a really big game. They're the opposite, end of the spectrum. You have these tiny games that are made with like just like a couple people just working, and then they can make a game. But the end of the spectrum, I'm talking about like a game like, I don't know, let's say you're a fan of Grand Theft Auto 5 or Red Dead Redemption 2, one of these really big games, AAA games. Yeah, those games are routinely made by teams of like 200 people, 300 people, and it's because there's just so much stuff in the game. Like you just need people churning out just tons and tons of stuff. I got a friend. She works for Bethesda Studios. So that's the company that made like Skyrim and that makes Fallout games and stuff. Her whole job, full-time job, her job is to make flowers, because these games have so many just little flowers all over the place. That's like her, not just flowers. She makes like she does other environmental stuff too, but so like rocks and stuff too. But environmental stuff, like that's her job. Like and I'm sure she's not the only one either. I mean, she's senior enough at this point that like she probably manages a whole staff of people who all they do is churn out all the different flowers and rocks for that you see in Skyrim or that you know when you're walking around Fallout. Like yeah.
So she describes her job and says like, I work in a flower shop.
Yeah. Well, she actually, it's funny on most of her social media profiles, like Twitter and stuff, she actually refers to herself as a flora witch. But anyway, but,
do you ever find any use cases or hear about people using Unity outside of the game and maybe for some sort of line of business application, or like a product catalog or kiosk or something like that, where you're
sure. Well, as he mentioned when introducing me in the first place, technically only 2 of the companies I've ever worked for were game companies. Synapse Games, that was doing mobile games. That's where I started using Unity. And then before that, so like I wasn't even using Unity yet. In Flash, I was developing Flash games for this company that did Flash games. Most of the companies I work for, including right now working for Qualcomm, they're not game companies. They're using Unity to do things that aren't necessarily games. For example, what I'm doing right now at Qualcomm is a lot of XR development, XR being an umbrella term for VR and AR. So a lot of virtual reality, a lot of augmented reality kind of stuff. So, it's one of those funny sort of tension points where within the Unity developer community, where it's sort of like, if Unity starts, like, on the one hand, if Unity isn't paying any attention to these other use cases, then people doing that stuff will be like, well, what the hell? Why aren't you paying any attention to us? But on the other hand, if Unity as a company pays too much attention to these other use cases, then all the game developers are going to be like, well, what the hell? This is a game engine. Why aren't you catering to us? And, can't win, right? So.
How much control does Microsoft have over Unity? Is Unity a separate company, or is it some
an
application model within Microsoft?
Unity is a completely separate company. Microsoft, as you can imagine, not just Microsoft, any really big tech company has some level of influence on what Unity is doing, but it's all going to be very indirect. Unity is just a separate company. When I say very indirect, for just obviously, whatever Xbox does, Unity cares a lot about. So
What is the experience like developing with Unity on Linux? Is that easy, or would it be better to do that within like a VM? Or?
I don't have any personal experience with that. I would note 2 things. First off, Unity, in terms of deployment targets, it's super cross-platform. I mean, you can deploy to all these different game consoles. You can deploy PC games, Mac, mobile games, whatever. And so, in terms of its Linux support, there, like if you wanted to build out your game as a Linux game, it works pretty well. In terms of actually working on Linux when you're developing, that's a different story. Because while Unity does, the Unity editor does run on Linux, it's far from a first-class citizen kind of, you know what I mean? So yeah, I'll be perfectly frank, I don't know of anyone doing any sort of anything close to, real projects that way. I mean, again, I certainly know of, people exporting, or building out Linux executables from Unity, but I don't know anybody using Unity on Linux. So.
Okay. But do you use Krita very much, or Krita? I saw it on your desktop, I think.
Do I use what? I'm sorry. Krita, yeah. Not that much. I mean, long story short, since I'm not a heavy, image editor, I'm not going to bother to, I didn't bother to get Photoshop or whatever, but every once in a while I need to edit an image, so just fire Krita. I mentioned Blender though is the tool, for example, I tend to rely on the most when I need to do anything with 3D models. Inkscape for doing vector graphics, whatever. So, it is funny, by the way. In a former life, is the way I like to put it. I was a 3D animator. For a brief period of time, right out of college, I was a 3D animator. I pretty quickly realized, though, that I liked programming the games more than just creating animations for them, and that's actually how I started doing Flash development. It was in this period where I was realizing I was better suited to programming these games, and eventually, when I pivoted to Unity, it was funny. It was sort of so even though in Flash I'd been making all these 2D games, I actually had tons of experience with 3D graphics from back when I used to be a 3D animator, and so
less of a technical question, but for someone who's trying to get into the field now, into Unity, either kind of a generalist or maybe a technical artist, Do you have any advice on how to stand out in the sea of applications, like
Sure.
getting a Unity certification, or maybe spending more time working on just trying to make a big beefy portfolio, or any insight on that?
Well, so the first thing I would say is you probably want to be pretty more specific about your target, like what you're trying to do. That's kind of a funny advice for me to give, because I definitely wasn't like that. But then again, my path in life took me forever to get where I am. I mean, like, so I'm 43, and it was probably like I was into my 30s already before like I could say like I'm a professional, game programmer. So that, that means like I pretty much like, just farted around. Obviously farting around is me glossing over a lot of what happened, but still, that means I spent almost a decade out of college, like just farting around, figuring out what I want to do with my life. So yeah, in terms of if you have a specific goal that you want to reach, you definitely would want to be more specific about it. Because as far as like which specific technical topics I would say to focus on, then it all depends what your goal is. Like, just as an example, you made reference to technical art. If you want to be a technical artist, I would say, brushing up on your shader skills, super high, very tightly important. Just, real quick, I'm not going to go into the details of shaders by any means, but like, just if you've never heard of shaders before, long story short, the way computer graphics actually work, all the different data about that does, it describes the scene, like all the different vertices in the meshes, all the different textures that are going to be applied to the meshes. All that data gets fed into these programs that have the kind of misnomer name of shaders, and shaders are programs. They take in all this, visual graphics data, and then they output a pixel. And then what GPUs do is they just run the shader over and over, massively parallel for every pixel on the screen, and so the shader just determines like, oh yeah, should be red here, should be pink here, should be whatever. Yeah, if you wanted to be a tech artist, then you would have to be really good at writing shaders. And, on the other hand, I don't know, if you wanted to be like, a network programmer for like online games, obviously that's a totally different skill set then. So yeah. Incidentally, given the background that, obviously I'm just making some assumptions here. I don't know you personally, but like just given the background of like, okay, a .NET developer, like, yeah, definitely something more involved with like the online engineering of games is probably going to be a great fit, or the the most obvious fit, because even though the graphics in the games is obviously, it's the flashiest part, it's what everyone thinks about, especially these days with so many online games, like there's just a ton that has to happen on the back end to get these games to work. I mean, obviously there's all kinds of security that has to happen so you don't get cheaters in your game. There's just a lot of networking infrastructure so that the games play without lag, even though they're really high performance and you got lots of players, shit like that. So yeah, I mean, on the flip side, though, then absolutely, there's lots of graphics engineers, people who know like how graphics work, computer graphics work. So yeah, like that again. To sort of boil it down, my answer to your question would be like probably the first thing to do is to get more specific about what how you want to get into the game industry, or what you want to do in the game industry. Now, this, by the way, oh sorry, I'm just.
Sorry, I just wanted to drop a link in there because I think there's a couple of people who are interested in learning a little bit more about this. This is somebody who streams on Twitch her game development, and she's been doing that for 2.5 years in Unity. So you see a lot of the problems that she runs into developing it and running into a problem when she tries it out, and also some of the artistic stuff, the 3D modeling, etc. So if you want to see somebody in action doing some Unity development,
no, absolutely. Thank you for dropping that link in. That actually relates to the next thing I was going to point out, though, is part of defining what you want to do, though, is also realizing, like, I mean, game development is really heterogeneous. There are lots of different kinds of games, and so a person like her, a person streaming, they're developing a game in Unity, a person like that is going to be on the very sort of like low scope, one person does everything kind of game. And if you want to be a person like that, I mean, that's a viable path too. But that's very much the opposite end then of the spectrum I was saying before, where like your big AAA games that have like 200 people working there, yeah, those 200 people like are really specialized to do like one thing really good. Versus someone like this Twitch streamer he's just pointed out, that's going to be somebody who's more of a generalist, does everything. But because it's just one person doing everything, obviously the game can't be that big. It's so I mean, just to give you to I guess a personal anecdote on that one, like even though I work for Qualcomm on these XR SDKs for them, I'm a huge fan of turn-based RPGs. That's my jam. Yeah, that's the kind of game I like. And so that means, in my sort of like downtime outside of work, I'm often dabbling in that kind of stuff as personal projects. Like I'm building these small turn-based RPGs as personal projects. So obviously, in those cases, then it's just me, and I got to do everything. So
You writing the next Final Fantasy?
Yeah, but it's funny. That's Final Fantasy is a series which, like, I was super into Final Fantasy when I was younger, and then I haven't played a single Final Fantasy game since like the PlayStation 2 era because
Oh, you got to revisit them. The remakes are fantastic. Now you know what I do in my spare time.
Well, what's really funny for me is so it's so weird actually that I'm not into Warhammer, because that is totally like, even though I've never played Warhammer, I know for a fact I would be super into it.
Yeah.
But I also know it's super expensive, and that's why I don't do it. I'm like, nope, not going down that road. So,
yeah. I can give you a whole bunch of suggestions for stuff like that. War Tales is a great game as well. I've seen that. I think that's turn-based as well. So, but yeah, on the other hand, what you were mentioning too about the networking, that is a whole specific subject as well, and it can be so bad if you get it wrong. We were playing at one point. We were playing New World, and there were issues with the networking, and it just dragged the whole game down.
By the way, linking back to Unity specifically, it's funny. So Unity has a networking library they provide, but there's all sorts of caveats around it. One being that it's not that old, so in other words, like, it's not like battle tested. You know what I mean? But on top of that, like, it's not that old, but also, like, there are just so many third-party providers of like networking services for Unity games that it's almost like it's kind of like bewildering. And like, who do I choose? Which one do I use? And the frank fact of the matter is, a lot of these sort of middleware like networking solutions are very much going to cater to indie developers, like those 1 person, 2 people working on a game by themselves, like, because they don't have the resources to build this networking system by themselves. On the other hand, your really professional game studios, they do have the resources to do that, and so yeah, they're usually going to prefer to have sort of a more in-house networking solution because they have more control over it. Because let's face it, if it's really good, then it provides a competitive advantage, so anyway.
It's interesting to look at all the different aspects that you have in game development, because you haven't even touched on music and stuff like that.
It's funny. There's one person tweeting. It was a joke, but it was like, it was this guy who was he's a game developer, and he tweeted just as a joke. He was like, "Yeah, nobody ever told me if you're making a game, you got to make everything." And so, again, it's, as people playing games, it's really easy to forget about that. It's like, these people are like, "Oh yeah, I was having an idea to do this." It's like, no, your idea. I mean, part of it is because there's just so much in the real world that you can just kind of take for granted as existing, but as soon as like these things are in the computer, you can't take anything for granted. Like, you have to make it all. Like, sunlight doesn't exist unless you make it. Like, dirt doesn't exist unless you make it. And like, so yeah. Whereas like, yeah, people are thinking like, oh yeah, it's, in the real world, like, if I wanted to, get my buddies and play around of, I don't know, paintball or something, then like, okay, yeah, we got to build this, our structures or whatever. But I mean, like, it's not like you have to build the field that you're playing on. Like, that's a thing that exists, So,
Are there any like open source games that you can maybe like get the whole game, and so you at least are modifying somebody else's work rather than you playing from the very first piece?
There are open source games, not very many though, and not very big, for a good reason. If you think about it, it's because like it's really hard to, like, with an open source project, it's really hard to motivate a large team towards a singular goal. With something like Linux, for example, there's just so many little things that need to happen. That works great for an open source model. You can do, all these different contributors can do the one little thing. Games aren't like that. It's I mean, like, yeah, you could have all your open source contributors contributing a rock, but who wants to do that? Like one
person who can contribute flowers.
Yeah, right. And, I'm pretty sure she has no desire to make flowers in her off time. But yeah, so I mean, so while there are open source games, there are very few of them. And another thing about them, they're almost all clones of something else. Like, it's especially hard to get anything original done that way, because again, like, if it's a clone of something, then you can have your big group of people and then just point out, like, we're making this, like, we're copying this, and then they're all gonna be like, oh, okay, and then they all get what they have to do. Whereas like if it's something original, it's sort of like, what are we even making? Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's really hard to communicate to a large group of people like what they're making, and it's especially hard when like these are volunteers. So like, you know, so yeah. And then on top of that, by the way, things get especially complicated when you. So okay, actually, let me backtrack a bit. So in Unity's asset store, like when people think about going to the asset store and buying an asset, they're mostly thinking in terms of like going and buying a model that something's created. However, you can buy other sorts of assets too, not just models. And remember what I mentioned before, that the script files are assets. So in other words, you can buy script files on the asset store. The logical endpoint there is that you can buy frameworks for complete games on the asset store. Like you can, it's like for $100, here's the code framework for, I don't know, a first-person shooter. And then you just got to provide all the different art assets and link them up to our scripts, and you got yourself a first-person shooter. Great, you can do that. They're taking that approach. There are obvious downsides in terms of like, well, you won't really know what's going on, blah blah blah. Like to learn the scripts other people wrote. Sorry, it's my daughter. I'm still busy, so.
I'm starving.
You're starving? Ask your brother for a snack. He can get your snack. Like, oh, you want to say hi? Sure.
Hi.
So, but no, so the notion of like, so you can go on the asset store and buy like the framework for a complete game. That sounds a lot better than it actually is in the end. Like, in the end, you'll buy this asset and you'll it's just gonna be a lot less useful to you than you might expect.
Yeah, it's very similar to. I actually picked up a Humble bundle with 2 frameworks in there, which are basically first-person shooters. But that's the only thing you can do. You can make a first-person shooter with it, and there's not a lot of other things you can do because you don't have access to the source code. And to your point, if you buy a framework from the asset store, yeah, you may have access to the source code, but it's written by somebody else, and he may not be so clear about how he wrote it. So,
well, there's the problem of like he might not be that clear, but as you also mentioned earlier, like a bigger problem is like you're restricted to like what they provide. Like you can only, your game is just what they provided. And like, yeah, you could customize it, but then you run into the other problem of like, well, now I got to understand his code in order to modify it. Usually, what like, so there's this other term you may have heard. So sometimes on Steam, people disparagingly refer to asset flips. This is more or less what they're getting at. It's like somebody goes on the asset store, buys for $100, here's a first-person shooter framework, and then just basically bangs out the most basic first-person shooter they can, and then puts it on Steam. And people refer to that as an asset flip. The obvious analogy there is with house flipping, where like you buy a house, do a few cosmetic changes, and then just try to sell it for I don't know, $100,000 more than you bought it for. So try to make money that way. So.
It's a great game, by the way, House Flipper. I can highly recommend it. As a game, not in real life, really.
Oh, any other questions?
We won't keep your daughter starving any longer. This was fantastic, Joe. Really appreciate you coming here and teaching us about Unity. There's a lot there, but I think you're providing a really good start for somebody who has never used it to get started. So I think this was really good, and I really appreciate you coming here and teaching us all. Come check us out next month, first Thursday of the month, which incidentally is the 1st of June, where we will have a fantastic presentation. I'm not sure exactly of what at the moment, but I think the subject is changing, I guess is what you were telling me earlier, right, Alex?
Yeah, it's changing. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem, but we will certainly have a fantastic presentation for you. Come check us out again on June 1st. Thanks, everybody.
All right.
Hey, thanks, guys. Good night, everybody.
Thanks, Toby.
Bye, guys.